Okay, so end live video. Let us know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's see.
I think we're live streaming on Facebook now, according to.
It says redirecting to Facebook Live. And you see it. Okay, we're checking with Belisa to see if it is working. And I'm actually not sure.
I had a notice for a minute that said we're live on Facebook.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's see. I think we are. And then let's see if we are live. Hello, everybody. This is the first time we've done Zoom to this is the first time we've done Zoom to Facebook Live, so we have some technical issues and we want to make sure. Okay, we want to make sure before we start the interview that it's actually working. Okay. Oh, okay, it says I see you. All right. Okay, great. So we're here. Hello. Hi, I am Genevieve Anderson, and I'm the writer-director of the feature film DUSTWUN, which many of you know. The DUSTWUN is a feature, a fable about friendship and a story about immigration and the wall and compassion. And being deeply concerned about issues surrounding immigration and having lived near the US-Mexico border for 4 years, we decided to do this series of Facebook Live interviews with different voices from the immigration advocacy community in and around Southern Arizona and beyond, to educate and illuminate about the current issues around immigration and asylum seekers happening right now, and how the upcoming election could impact people who are most affected. So today, I'm really excited to be with Alyson Ball, who is the chair of the Immigration Action Team for Alliance for Action in Green Valley. And Alyson has this wonderful presentation on immigration basics that I suggest all of you take a look at. I put the link in the notes. And we're going to be talking today about some of the challenges and the issues that that she raises in this presentation, and hopefully learn some new things today. So welcome, Alyson. So glad that you're here.
Thank you.
So I'm really interested, and I actually don't know this yet, even though I've been getting to know you, why the topic of immigration interests you and how you got involved.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, Genevieve. I was a Spanish and French major in college and ended up having a career really in international business. So I sort of come at it from a different angle. And after we retired, we started going to Green Valley, Arizona from Virginia to spend our winters. And I started looking into the border and immigration issues from that perspective. And I ended up taking about 2 years to just try to figure out what was our history, what were our laws, where did we stand on immigration in general, why were we at the place that we were. And that really was the genesis of the presentation that you saw. That was the reason why I put it together, just to inform other Americans about our system. I thought most people maybe didn't have a background or understanding of that. So that was why I put that presentation together.
Wonderful. Well, it's so informative. I learned so much. So tell us about Alliance for Action.
Yes, well, Alliance for Action is a political action committee in Green Valley, Arizona, that was started in 2017. And we have different action groups. There's a climate group, there's an education group, a healthcare group, and an immigration group.
So what does the Alliance for Action Immigration Action Team do?
Yeah, so the Immigration Action Team, as the others, we're really, our goal is to inform Americans as well as to advocate for positive immigration reform and to draw some light on the injustices that we see in immigration. So we have a list of people on our team all over the country, and people can sign up at the website to become part of this team, and we send out calls to action. Those are either supporting immigration as we see it, or immigration reform, or as I said, drawing attention to those injustices that we see in immigration.
What issues are currently at the top of the list of the most critical immigration topics?
Well, there are quite a few right now that are quite critical. The one we focus on quite a bit because we're near the border is the issue of asylum. As you know, asylum is something that's given by law to all people can come to the U.S. and seek asylum, and it's based on international treaties we've signed as well as our U.S. laws. And what that means is people can come and present themselves at our border, present their cases in a court of law before an immigration judge, and if it is deemed that their case is valid, then they have a pathway to citizenship. As of now, with the Trump administration, the border has been closed for asylum seekers. So we have a whole series of issues going on right now at the border. We have about 26,000 people in northern Mexico who have not had a chance yet to make that first contact with the US and do what's called the credible fear interview. So 6,000 people are waiting in northern Mexico to make this request. And we also have another 60,000 people who've had their first credible fear interview with the US. They're waiting for their court hearing with an immigration judge, but they've been sent back to Mexico in a very, very unusual move, sent back to Mexico to wait for their court hearing in the US as to whether they have an asylum case that would allow them to become citizens and then live in the United States.
You say it's an unusual move. So what is unusual about sending them to Mexico, not letting them in?
What we've signed in the international treaties is called non-refoulement. It's a French term, and this is a United Nations term that basically says, if you're a signatory of these treaties, as a country, you will not turn people back into harm's way. And in fact, to have these folks who've passed the credible fear test, generally they would come to live in the US. They would be able to reside here until they had time to come to the court hearing whenever that was scheduled. In this case, the US is turning these people back to Mexico to wait in Mexico. And in fact, as someone who's either a Mexican or a third party from a third party country, these people who are very vulnerable are in some of the most dangerous places in Mexico. So they have set up tent cities in Matamoros, for example, which is near Brownsville, Texas. We have people living in Nogales, Sonora, which is across from Nogales, Arizona. About 700 people are waiting in order to come in with this, it's called the Remain in Mexico or the Migrant Protocol Protection law that was put into place during the Trump administration. The unusual part is sending them back to harm's way when we should be taking them in and taking care of them based on our laws as well as the treaties we've signed.
Okay. I'm tempted to jump around with my questions, but I'm going to stick to the order. There's so much to unpack just with that. So, but I think it's important to talk about what causes people to leave their country and seek asylum in the United States, or what causes people to cross the border without documentation. We're talking about two things: asylum seekers. We're also talking about people who cross the desert without documentation. So what are the root causes of both of these things?
Good question, a good question. So the root cause of all of this northern migration, as well as migration around the world, we have climate change reasons, which are going to become more important as time goes on. But it's poverty and violence are the two things that drive people north. Now, we don't have asylum for economic problems. Just because you're poor is not a reason for you to be able to come live here and become a citizen. But by law, if you have been persecuted and you have not been able to get help from your government, as many of the people who are coming north qualify for, then we will be able to give you asylum. So people at great peril to themselves leave their homelands, and oftentimes this splits up families. So this is not an easy decision to make, and it is not one that these people make lightly, to decide, I can either no longer live here because I'm not safe and my family's not safe, and or I can't stay where where I've grown up because there is no work for me here. So people come north seeking a better life. Now, what we do see in northern Mexico is, because the waiting time is so long for that first credible fear interview, if you wait and present yourself at the port of entry, then what we're seeing is people give up and they just cross the border on their own. And again, people who are staying in the shelters in northern Mexico are told it's very dangerous to cross the border. It's very unlikely you will be able to do that without harm and or including dying, and people do it anyway. So it's quite an act of desperation to cross the border between the ports of entry. It's many days in often over 100-degree heat that these people are crossing the border.
I am going to jump down to a lower question because it's pertinent and tied into this question, which is about, and you talk about this in your presentation, the ways in which the United States has participated in destabilizing many of the countries that these asylum seekers come from. So can you talk a little bit more about what that means, and with the intention of trying to tie that into how we come up with effective immigration reform, right? We don't want to demonize the United States for doing what they're doing, but we do need to understand what propels this constant stream of asylum seekers.
So, yes, so this was an area that I wasn't as familiar with when I started my research on immigration as I needed to be, and I'm still really learning about it as I go along. There's a wonderful YouTube on this topic called Harvest of Empire, and I'd highly recommend it if someone wants to look into this topic of how has the US been involved in these countries. Sadly, what I learned was things like our military has been involved and continues to be involved with the governments, and sometimes not the government groups that are in these countries, and either supporting one side or another, and or training the military in those countries. So militarily, we are definitely involved. We are working with these different countries to secure their own borders, because we know if, for example, the border between Honduras and Guatemala and the border between Guatemala and Mexico is more secure, then fewer people would be able to migrate northward if those borders were tighter. So we're doing work militarily at their borders as well as our own. One of the things I learned was that NAFTA in 1994 was a more of an economic treaty that was signed between us and Mexico. And we always hear about what a great job this was to promote work in Mexico for Mexican people. And in fact, there are many what are called maquiladores on the northern side of the of Mexico, on just south of the border in Nogales. So that part worked out well. What we didn't hear so much about was the fact that this treaty was also going to allow US corn manufacturers to sell their corn in Mexico. And because of the way we grow our corn here in very large farms, we can grow it for less than the small Mexican grower could. And in fact, we could provide corn at a lower price in the Mexican market than the Mexican farmers could. And therefore we drove about 1 million Mexican corn farmers out of business.
Wow.
And sadly, the discussions at the time when that treaty was being designed and developed and signed, the people that were involved in that decision, both from the Mexican government and the US government, knew in fact that this would be the result, that there would be a dramatic effect in the agriculture of Mexico, and it would start to drive people into poverty there, which was going to drive people north. We knew that it would happen, but we didn't exactly prepare. The goal was to raise the economic level of people in Mexico across the board. What we didn't realize was how many people were going to be left without employment and work. So those are two examples, the military as well as the economic, where we've been involved in issues that are creating either violence or poverty or both in these countries. So going back to the root causes is a pretty critical part of the solution in the long run, in my opinion, because if you have poverty and or violence in your hometown, then you are going to be wanting to leave regardless of what you face here. I've heard people say, I don't mind sitting in detention. It's certainly better than living home with the problems that I had or the violence that I faced or the risks that my family faced. I'll take whatever is ahead of me because it can't be any worse than what I had. So these are desperate people who need to get away from where they're living. And it's difficult, I think, for us on this side of the border to really understand how desperate they are, which is driving them north.
And one of the things that we don't talk about enough in terms of the economics is we don't break down what it means for corporations always to be trying to maximize profit through seeking cheap labor. We complain about no jobs can't go overseas and they can't go to, we shouldn't be employing cheap labor because we need to keep the jobs in the United States, but nobody's willing to pay the wages that need to be paid in the United States. And nobody's willing to decrease profit. So if the maximum is always to maximize profit, as much as possible, we can't actually have, it seems like we can't have both, right? We can't maximize profit and have peaceable, workable solutions where people are paid wages that keep them from, to keep jobs from going over the border and keep them from coming over here. And I don't know what the solution to that is, but it certainly seems to be something that needs to be addressed.
Right. We as Americans have really benefited from the folks who come north and who are working in our agriculture particularly, but also you've heard recently during COVID of the people in the meat plants. A lot of these people are either unauthorized or they're recent immigrants. And we certainly have all benefited from the labor that we have been paying, which is not a good wage. We've been benefiting in our lives from that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in your presentation, you say that there are 11 million unauthorized residents in the United States, 53% of whom are Mexican, down from 57%, I think you said just a few years ago. What accounts for this decrease?
Well, there are a couple of things. One of the things about the unauthorized that I learned, and which I think is pretty significant, is that we have people who cross the border, that we have like here in Arizona, California, Texas, but we also have more than half the people now who overstayed their visas. So there are two reasons why we have people who are unauthorized. Border crossers are just half of the number of the 11 million. And the greater half now, and the one that's increasing the most, are people who come here on temporary visas, like education and work temporary visas or business visitation, and they end up overstaying their visa longer than necessary and just blend into the system. Now, the reason Mexicans as a percentage of the total are going down is because as that number is increasing, fewer and fewer are actually coming from Mexico. And what we're finding is that some of the Mexicans who've been here for many years, 20 and 30 years, are actually going home to live, either in their town or village the economic situation has improved, or they've been able to improve their economic situation enough that they can return home. So there are two things really happening. It's just the numbers are overtaking the total, but also, and I think the overstayers, few of those overstayers would be from Mexico. The overstayers would more likely be Europeans, they would be Africans, they would be Asians rather than Central Americans.
That's interesting. And I also thought it was interesting, you said that 2/3 of the residents have been in the United States for 10 years or longer.
Right, right.
And this number reflects, it seems, the deep generational ties between the United States and Mexico, and also our dependence on labor, like we say, from Mexico and from Central America. So knowing that, how do you think that should reflect on immigration reform?
Well, I think the studies show that there are so many people who have been here for so long. 2/3, as you said, have been here longer than 10 years, but something like 1/3 of them have been here more than 20 years. So these are people who've lived in our communities and been contributing to our communities, some of whom you would never even know that they're not American citizens. And so when we start to think, and they've had children here, remember that if I'm here as an unauthorized person and I've been living here for 10 or 20 years, the probability is that I also have had children while I've been here, and those children who are born here are American citizens. So we have something like 16 million people in the US who are in mixed status families. This is a very complicated issue, so that we have some families with some unauthorized and some citizens. Either parents both are unauthorized or one or the other, but citizen children are being born into these families. And so the ties are deep and strong. So the question is, like with DACA, the deferred action for childhood arrivals, those folks who came here as young children that were brought here by their parents and were raised here as American children, but just did not have citizenship. And we know that there was a program for these DACA students to be able to work and live and go to school and have employment here in the States legally while they maintain their status. So these kinds of programs have been very useful, but immigration reform, which would have to come from Congress, would actually change the underlying laws to allow them to stay here, as we might consider allowing somebody who's been here for 20 or 30 years, worked, paid taxes, become a part of the community. These might be issues we could consider as we look at immigration reform possibilities.
Well, on the tail of that, I do have to ask, because it confounds me. Why do you think DACA, particularly because it's been in the news, enrages people so much? Why does it make, why is there a faction in the United States of in conservative thinking that wants to undermine this very sane and practical project?
I think that if you are someone who is not looking at the details of the specific examples, but you're just thinking in theory about what has occurred here, your thinking is, this is somebody who has broken the law by being here, and therefore they should not deserve to become citizens. And generally, if you speak to people who are of this opinion, they have a black and white opinion about the issue, and they think if they were not here legally from the start, they should not be allowed to become. We should not reward with citizenship those people who have broken the law. I think that's what they would say.
Okay, yeah. Understood. So the detention centers, you talk a lot about that in your presentation, and obviously they've been featured in the news because of the forced separations between families and their children. And the detention, so that forced separation was a measure of what's called prevention by deterrence, and I'm not sure if people know what that means. Can you talk a little bit about prevention by deterrence and what the primary intention is behind it.
Yes, yes. Prevention by deterrence really is a term that was started being used by the US government in the 1980s. And the point was, let us prevent people from coming here by deterring them, which is why they started building border walls, first in the cities along the border, and then eventually further and further out into the desert or along the river in Texas. And it's a theory or a strategy that really doesn't appear to be working, because as we talked about earlier, people who are in desperate situations like they are not going to be deterred by anything. They're not going to stop because they know they have to leave where they are, and they're going to take every chance they can take to come to the US to start a new life. And so all these different measures that are taken, for example, if we just build our wall in the city and we force people around the city where we are so that they come through the desert, people will know it's too dangerous to come through the desert, but so they'll be deterred from coming, and they won't come. Or if they know that we're taking their children away from them if they cross the border, that word will get out and they won't come. Or if it gets out that we're sending them to detention centers rather than able to move to Philadelphia or some other place to live with their relatives, that will prevent them from coming. But in fact, what we are learning is very little, if anything, is going to prevent these people from trying to come here. So that's what prevention through deterrence means. It's an ill-conceived strategy that doesn't really work.
It doesn't really work. And I think everybody can agree that it's inhumane just based on the reaction to the forced separations, which, even though I think it seems that was, taken off the docket, they're not allowed to do that anymore in detention centers. There's still obviously many, many reports of children being still separated from their parents.
Yes.
Do you know anything about what's going on with that?
Yes, a couple things. First of all, the children that had been separated from their parents, in many cases haven't been reconciled with their parents yet. Some of the parents had been deported to other countries and they cannot find them. Other children were just, in fact, on paper, lost in the system. It's unbelievable that a country of our size and nature and wealth that this could happen, but that's in fact what has happened. Today, there are about 300 family members, so men, women, and children. 300, about 127 of those are children, are in family detention centers in Texas and Pennsylvania are where the family detention centers are being held. There's an agreement, there's a legal agreement called the Flores Agreement that says that a child can only be kept in detention for 20 days at the most. But these children have been in detention for much longer, these families. They're asylum-seeking families, but they've landed in detention. And so a judge decided that they needed to be let out and said to the government, you must let these children out and not hold them past 20 days. What the government did was go to these people and ask them to sign a sheet of paper. They gave them a choice. The choice was either A, we will allow your child to be released from detention, but you're going to stay in detention and you might be deported, but we'll get your child out of detention if you'd like. The choice B was, or you can have your child continue to stay in detention with you, but the risk you take there is that you might be infected with COVID. Many of the detention centers around the country are being overwhelmed with COVID, as was predicted, because there wasn't enough preventative measures being taken. We've had so far 6 people die in the detention centers because of COVID, and I think 2 or 3 employees of the detention centers have died because of COVID, and something like 5,000 people have been COVID positive tested.
Wow.
They're just perfect places for COVID to spread. Detention centers generally are large, that people stay in large dormitories where they might have bunk beds up and down, maybe 50 to 75 people in each quote pod. So the living conditions are just ripe for the spread of COVID. It's not a surprise that this happened, and heroic efforts are going on throughout the country even now, trying to get the lawyers to plead to get some of these high-risk folks out of detention because of COVID. Some of that's been successful, but not enough. There's still about 20,000 people being held in detention right now, in immigration detention.
Wow.
Around the country.
Can
Many
you-
of them in private prisons. Many of them are privately held for-profit prisons that handle immigrant detention in this country.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I don't think we know enough about who runs these detention centers by and large.
There are really three different kinds of detention centers. There are a few federally owned and operated detention centers for immigrants. That's maybe 10 or 20%. There are also another 10 or 20% that are local jails, local county or city jails that lease their space to the federal government for immigrants. So that's another 10 to 20%. And about 70 or 80% of the immigrant detainees are held in private for-profit jails or detention centers. And there's a Geo Group and Core Civic are the two largest, but there are many other smaller organizations that literally issue stock, and you can make money based on immigrant detention.
Oh, that's hard to digest. So you'd mentioned something again in your talk about a pay per prisoner, or there's something about how each detainee, there's a price for that detainee. Who's paying that? Where is that money coming from?
The money comes from the federal government. So your taxes and my taxes are going to the federal government, and then the federal government is paying these private prisons to hold folks. And so when you look at the contracts for the private prisons, you see there's an agreement between, in some cases, it's an agreement between the federal government and the local entity, like the local county, and then there's a second agreement between the local entity, like the county, and ICE, and the private prison. So it's kind of a two-part contract that allows the federal government to pay so much per person per day for the handling of these detainees. Now, of course, as you would expect, the government is bargaining for a very low price, but at the same time, the private prison, the fewer expenses they can have for maintaining these people, the more profits they have. So what you see is very low wages, the fewer expenses on medical issues and food, the better.
Interesting.
So they can make the most profit off these immigrant detainees.
Wow.
It's also a system, by the way, that goes beyond immigrant detention. Private prisons are, most states in the country use private prisons. The federal system uses private prisons. It's not just immigrant detainees.
It's the same model.
That's right.
Imprisonment. Well, in line with that, you mentioned in your talk that one of the biggest challenges in immigration policy during the Trump administration has been the criminalization of undocumented migrants and asylum seekers. You started to talk a little bit about the asylum, the 1951 Refugee Convention, the Asylum Protocols, basically, that we have largely thrown out. So in your opinion, what has prompted us to do that? What do you think people are actually really afraid of that would prompt us to violate this basic human rights policy so egregiously?
That's a lot of questions. Let's see if we can back up.
Yeah.
I think this administration has particularly focused on immigration because they know that among the American people, mostly the conservatives, who maybe aren't as willing to embrace the other or the foreigner or someone who is unlike them, it's a very popular play. So I think Trump has chosen well. He's also figured out that even though our system is based on laws, that there are many things that he can do administratively that no one is going to stop him from doing. So, for example, the fact that he's taking defense budget money and putting it towards the border wall, and people are not able to stop him from doing that, is a pretty clever move. Or changing administratively, many of the decisions of late that have taken place are based on the fact that we have COVID. And so people are afraid of COVID. And so he's able to close the border and say only essential business will move through the border because we are afraid of COVID. Or we're going to take unaccompanied minors, young children who come across the border on their own, of which there are many, who are eager to come here to be with their parents who maybe have lived here for many years, and they want to come stay with them. Young children will come by themselves, and these children are being deported immediately under the guise of COVID. So the COVID is a perfect example for closing off some of the avenues, not only for these folks at the border, but sadly for family reunification visas, which is has been historically our main source of new citizens every year, which is very important to this country. Again, because of COVID, this has been shut off. So the three main reasons why we have always had a steady stream of new citizens in this country for family reunifications, either for work rationale or for humanitarian, either we'll take refugees in or asylum seekers. Those three are the main reasons we get generally about 1 million new citizens a year here in the US. And we've cut this way back just to a small number. And I'm afraid that the American public is not aware of how the system works, or the fact that we're not taking these people in anymore. And they are a huge source of our economic growth, of our cultural creativity, and just the robustness of our culture is taking these new people in, but we're not getting them. And we're going to be feeling the effects of this for many years, I'm afraid.
Interesting. I just heard something last week in a short video on immigration I was watching on YouTube that actually to apply for a visa, the backlog is about 24 years. When we were talking about why people don't, why people choose to come over undocumented, that actually the visa issue is next to impossible. So I don't know, again, I mean, that's what you're saying.
Right.
If that came about just in this administration, or if that's something more longstanding, but it's pretty daunting for people who need to get here, I know.
Right. What you're saying is, if I wanted to go get in line in the legal line, which is what some people say, why don't these people just get in line? Because our family visa program puts a limit on each country, on its numbers per year. The most popular countries we bring people here from are Mexico and the Philippines and China. And these places have so many people who want to come here that there's over a 20-year wait to come here. So you could get in line to get a visa, but you'd be waiting 24 years out. So that's exactly right, what you're saying.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, we didn't talk about this question, but I think it's important for people to know what's actually happening with the border wall, because we know that there is a border wall that already exists, and there's also a new and improved, more expansive border wall that is being built right now. And there have been protests around these walls. There have been people from the clergy going out and praying at the walls. People are being displaced by these walls. So is there anything you can tell us about what's happening on the ground with the construction of the new wall?
Yes, yes. As I said, we are continuing to build the wall, and it's something that, I mean, I'm not sure that it gets much press, but the Trump administration has chosen to take some money from defense, from the defense budget, and put that into the building of the wall. Right now in Sassabee in Arizona, there is a wall being built. This has devastating effects on the environment. One of the things we have in Arizona are jaguars that come up from Mexico. Very few, but the few do come, and they will not certainly be able to migrate if there's a wall. It also is problematic for water tables, water in the desert. There are all kinds of effects on Native American territories. In some cases, the border wall near us is the Tohono O'odham Nation, and this border goes right through their land. And the border wall that they want to build is not only goes through their land, but also goes through their sacred sites. So even though their culture and their history crosses the border, and they have been able to move freely up and down their territory between the US and Mexico for many years, this is being disturbed right now. But the border wall is going on. They, in some cases, the border wall is small, just vehicle barriers that you could physically take down are being replaced by tall borders. So there is some replacement going on. The new ones in Sassabee are 30 feet high. Mostly they're 18 feet high. So these are higher border walls. There aren't very many new models of border walls, but the imperviousness of the new walls makes it a big problem, bigger than it's ever been. So they're still working and building these new border walls. Of the 2,000 miles at the southern border, there are about 650 miles of physical border wall that's been built to date.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
How effective do you think these walls are really in curtailing people coming over?
I don't think they're useful at all. They might slow people down a little bit in some cases, but the people who really want to be here aren't going to be stopped by a wall, and they will find a way over or under or around those walls. So I think it's almost an eyewash to build the walls.
Is it then the construction of the wall is more about posturing perhaps than about anything, right? If it's not actually effective, it's just a symbol of our stance on immigration.
I think, yes, I think it's a statement, and it plays well for people who aren't really paying attention or who don't really understand this part of the country.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you look at the people who support the wall, even those in Congress tend to be people who are not near the wall.
Right, right. What do you think needs to change in our nation's perception of immigration?
I think, sadly, most Americans are not as informed as they need to be about the immigration issue and the importance of immigration to us. As I think I mentioned before, economically, we need an influx of people to keep our economy growing. We are certainly a more creative nation as a result of the immigrants. If you look at studies, you can see that the immigrants that come are very resourceful and very creative, and they help our economy as a result. And just the mix of cultures is a positive issue in our nation. And I think sometimes those of us who are in favor of immigration are not speaking up enough about this issue. And sadly, those who are against the immigration tend to have it be a higher priority in their lives or politically in their thinking. And so they're willing to speak up against it. And we just need to try to find more people who are willing to speak up in support of immigration and the fact that this is a positive, net positive for our culture and for our economy.
Wow. I love that you said that, and I couldn't agree more, because a lot of what stops us too is like, it's too big. What can I do? What can I
Right.
possibly do? And one of the things we can do, obviously, is vote, right? And we can also continue to educate ourselves and learn, basically go deeper into things we already think we know, right? To go past easy assumptions and reductive thinking about us and them, or this or that, or conservative or liberal, and really look at the more nuanced, the more nuanced conversation, right? Which, at the base of which is, how are we treating one another?
Yes.
Which is critical, right? It's the most important thing.
Right. And there's all kinds of things to do locally. Every community, whether they see them or not, has unauthorized folks living in their community, as well as new immigrants. And so there are ways to help resettle refugees. There are ways to support the immigrant community, and just reaching out and figuring out how can we support this community would be a positive step. And you see that in certain communities that have successfully integrated immigrants into their community. And studies show that they're more vibrant, that the local communities, if they've been successful at integrating immigrants, they have a more thriving culture and a more thriving economy. So it makes sense to support them and to provide the welcoming that we want to see.
That's great. And I'm going to put in the notes to under this interview your wonderful talk on the immigration basics, which I recommend everybody take a look at. It's so informative and really, really important. And then also, of course, the link to Alliance for Action, so if people want to see what you guys are doing there. And if there's anything else that you would like, any resources that you think people should have.
I think the Harvest of Empire on YouTube is another good one. If people want to look into the history of the root causes and how did America get involved and how could we get involved, that would be great. And as you said, if somebody really is anywhere in the country wants to get involved in just not so much the politics, but informing and educating their fellow Americans, or sending information to their Congress people and pushing them, then they could sign up for the Alliance for Action immigration team and get the calls to action. Yeah.
That's great. No, it's wonderful that you guys do that. I think you're a wonderful organization. You've been so generous with me just as a creative person and helping to get this series together. So I really appreciate what you do. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me today. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Likewise, we'll do it again. And also I wanted to let anybody out there watching know that our movie DUSTWUN is available for any organization that wants to show it, to either raise money for your organization or just to have kind of a community event. And you can check out I'll put that in the, well, actually you're on the page. I think you're on the DUSTWUN page. So it has a link to the website where you can see the trailer and learn more about what it is. So again, thank you so much for your time, Alyson, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Genevieve.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.